Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might surprise you. Ancient Chinese junk food. Yes, even in a world of imperial dynasties, elegant tea ceremonies, and definitely no McDonald's, people still found ways to snack. And let me tell you, some of it was absolutely delicious, some of it was questionable, and all of it was deeply, deeply Chinese. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient China, if you wanted something crispy, hot, and regrettable for your health, you reached for youtiao. These golden twisted sticks of fried dough were the closest thing to donuts that existed thousands of years ago, minus the sugar glaze and plus a healthy dose of political drama. Let's be clear, youtiao weren't created in some peaceful monastery kitchen by contemplative monks. No, they were born from pure spite. According to legend, they were invented during the Song dynasty as an act of culinary rebellion against Qin Hui, a corrupt official who betrayed the beloved general Yue Fei. The dough was shaped like two people stuck together and then thrown into boiling oil, symbolically frying the traitor and his wife for eternity. Charming, right? Nothing says breakfast food like a side of political revenge. The actual preparation was surprisingly simple, which is probably why youtiao survived for over 1,000 years. Flour, water, salt, and a bit of alkaline powder were mixed into a dough, then left to rest overnight. The next morning, the dough was rolled out, cut into strips, and paired up before being twisted together and plunged into a vat of bubbling oil. The oil was usually recycled until it could probably vote. Street vendors kept their oil going for days, sometimes weeks, adding flavour that was charitably described as complex and less charitably described as questionable. But when fresh youtiao came out of that oil, crispy and golden, they were absolute perfection. They were light, airy inside, with a satisfying crunch that could wake the dead. And they were cheap enough that even the poorest labourers could afford them for breakfast, usually dunked in soy milk or rice porridge to soften them up and add some actual nutrition to what was essentially deep-fried gluten. Vendors would set up shop on street corners before dawn, their oil already hot and ready for the morning rush. The sound of sizzling dough and the smell of frying oil became the unofficial alarm clock of Chinese cities. Workers would grab a few sticks on their way to the rice fields or silk workshops, eating them while walking because apparently multitasking during breakfast is not a modern invention. Did they sometimes come out too greasy? Absolutely. Were they occasionally undercooked in the middle? Sure. Did anyone care when they were hot, cheap, and available at 6 in the morning? Not even slightly. Youtiao were democratic food. Emperors ate them, peasants ate them, monks ate them, while pretending they weren't enjoying themselves too much. They were fast, filling, and just indulgent enough to make you forget that your other meal options included rice, more rice, and if you were lucky, rice with vegetables. And yes, they were probably terrible for your health, but in a world where the average lifespan was about as long as a modern college degree, people weren't exactly counting calories. They were counting flavours, and youtiao delivered every single time. If youtiao were the morning's guilty pleasure, tangaloo were the afternoon's sweet salvation. Picture this: fresh fruit speared on bamboo sticks and coated in a shell of crystallized sugar, so hard it could chip a tooth. They were basically candy apples, if candy apples had been invented by someone who believed dessert should also double as a weapon. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Take whatever fruit was in season, hawthorn berries being the traditional choice, thread them onto thin bamboo skewers, and dip them in boiling sugar syrup until they're encased in a glass-like coating that cracked like ice when you bit into it. Hawthorn berries were particularly popular because they were tart enough to balance the intense sweetness of the sugar coating. Plus, they were believed to aid digestion, which was convenient because you'd need all the help you could get after eating what was essentially fruit wrapped in crystallized diabetes. The sugar coating wasn't just for flavour, it was for preservation. In an era before refrigeration, dipping fruit in hard candy was one of the few ways to make it last longer than a day without attracting every fly in the province. It was ancient food science disguised as a treat. Street vendors specialised in tanghulu would set up elaborate displays, arranging the skewers in wooden racks like edible bouquets. The sight of dozens of glossy, ruby-red treats catching the sunlight was enough to stop anyone in their tracks. Children would press their faces against the display cases, fogging up the glass while deciding which stick looked the most promising. But here's where it gets interesting. Tanghulu wasn't just about the fruit. Creative vendors would thread on other items: walnuts, mini rice cakes, even small pieces of dried meat for the adventurous. It was like a medieval kebab, but sweet instead of savoury, and far more likely to result in dental emergencies. The eating experience was a small adventure in itself. First, you had to crack through the sugar shell, which required commitment and strong teeth. Then came the burst of tart fruit juice, followed by the chewy texture of the hawthorn berry. It was sweet, sour, crunchy, and chewy all at once, like nature couldn't decide what it wanted to be when it grew up. Tanghulu vendors were also early masters of seasonal marketing. Spring brought fresh strawberries, summer offered grapes, autumn featured persimmons, and winter saw creative combinations of dried fruits and nuts. They adapted to whatever was available, proving that innovation in junk food is not a modern concept. Did the sugar coating sometimes crack off in inconvenient chunks? Yes. Did it occasionally cut the inside of your mouth? Also yes. Did people continue buying them anyway? Absolutely, because when you're craving something sweet in ancient China, your options were limited to honey, dates, or risking your teeth on tanghulu. And unlike modern candy, tanghulu had the illusion of being healthy. After all, it was fruit. Never mind that it was fruit wrapped in enough sugar to send a hummingbird into orbit. It was the original health food marketing scam, and people fell for it every time. Now let's talk about something that divided ancient Chinese society more effectively than politics or religion: stinky tofu. This fermented, aged, deeply aromatic block of soy product was either the most delicious thing you'd ever tasted or the most offensive assault on your senses since someone invented fermented fish sauce. Stinky tofu wasn't accidentally discovered by someone who forgot regular tofu in a corner. No, this was intentional. Some enterprising cook during the Qing dynasty looked at perfectly normal, mild-mannered tofu and thought, you know what this needs? More funk. And so began one of the most polarizing foods in human history. The preparation process was elaborate and slightly terrifying. Fresh tofu was submerged in a brine made from fermented milk, dried shrimp, amaranth leaves, mustard greens, bamboo shoots, and Chinese herbs. This mixture was left to age for anywhere from a few days to several months, depending on how brave the cook was feeling and how much they enjoyed making their neighbours question their life choices. The result was tofu that had developed a smell so distinctive it could clear a room or attract a crowd, depending on your perspective. It wasn't just smelly, it was aggressively aromatic in a way that seemed to have its own personality. Walking past a stinky tofu vendor was like being introduced to someone who had very strong opinions and wasn't shy about sharing them. But here's the thing, once you got past the smell, and that was a significant hurdle, stinky tofu was actually incredible. It was crispy on the outside from deep frying, creamy on the inside, with a complex umami-rich flavour that was unlike anything else in the ancient Chinese culinary arsenal. It was funky, savoury, and oddly addictive. Street vendors would deep fry cubes of stinky tofu in oil that had absorbed months of aromatic history. They'd serve it hot, usually with a spicy sauce made from chili oil, garlic, and soy sauce that helped bridge the gap between the initial smell and the eventual deliciousness. The social dynamics around stinky tofu were fascinating. Eating it was almost like joining a secret club. Those who loved it became evangelical, trying to convert friends and family with the fervour of people who had discovered a hidden truth. Those who hated it did so with equal passion, acting as if stinky tofu vendors were personally attacking their nostrils. Interestingly, stinky tofu became a test of character. Could you handle the smell? Were you brave enough to try something that challenged your preconceptions? It was like an ancient version of a trust fall, except instead of catching you, your friends were watching to see if you'd gag or ask for seconds. The preparation also varied by region because apparently regular stinky tofu wasn't diverse enough. Some areas fermented it longer, others added different herbs to the brine, and a few regions developed white stinky tofu alongside the more common black variety. It was like a fermented tofu arms race, with each area trying to outfunk the others. Did it smell like something had died and been forgotten in a swamp? Yes. Did people line up to buy it anyway? Absolutely. Because in the ancient world, if something was that memorable, that challenging, and that distinctive, it had to be good for something. And stinky tofu was good for building character, if nothing else. The vendors who specialised in stinky tofu were a special breed. They had to have strong stomachs, stronger friendships, and the thickest skin imaginable. Their shops were easily identifiable from several blocks away, and they attracted customers who knew exactly what they were getting into. No one stumbled upon stinky tofu by accident. Before crepes were sophisticated Parisian cafe fare, there was jianbing, the Chinese street breakfast that managed to be both elegant and completely unpretentious at the same time. This was comfort food masquerading as convenience food, and it had been perfecting the art of handheld breakfast for over 1,000 years. The beauty of jianbing was in its theatre as much as its taste. Vendors would set up portable stoves with perfectly seasoned cast iron griddles, and the entire cooking process was performance art. They'd pour a thin layer of batter onto the hot surface, using a wooden scraper to spread it into a perfect circle with the kind of casual precision that comes from making thousands of them. The batter itself was a mixture of mung bean flour, wheat flour, and water, sometimes with a bit of millet thrown in for texture. It created a crepe that was sturdier than its French cousin, but still delicate enough to fold without breaking. This wasn't accidental. It was engineering. The jianbing had to be strong enough to hold fillings, but thin enough to cook quickly on a street corner. Once the base was set, the vendor would crack an egg directly onto the crepe, spreading it out until it covered the entire surface. Then came the first sprinkle of chopped scallions, sesame seeds, and cilantro, because apparently even ancient Chinese street food understood that presentation mattered. But the real magic happened next. The vendor would flip the entire thing, revealing a perfectly golden surface, and begin adding the supporting cast. A thin layer of fermented black bean sauce, sweet bean sauce, or chili sauce went on first, followed by a piece of crispy fried dough, lettuce leaves, and sometimes pickled vegetables or additional herbs. The final step was the fold. With practiced hands, the vendor would fold the jianbing into a neat portable package that could be eaten while walking to work, standing at a market stall, or sitting on a low stool, watching the world go by. It was designed for people who had places to be and things to do, but still wanted to eat something that tasted like care and attention. The flavours were complex in a way that seemed almost accidental. The crepe was mild and slightly nutty, the egg added richness, the sauces provided umami depth, and the herbs brought freshness. The crispy dough in the middle gave it textural interest and prevented the whole thing from being too soft. It was like eating a perfectly balanced ecosystem. Jianbing vendors were the morning heroes of ancient Chinese cities. They'd set up before dawn, preparing batters and heating griddles so that by the time the first workers emerged, breakfast was ready. There was something deeply comforting about the consistency of it. The knowledge that no matter how chaotic your day was going to be, at least breakfast would be reliable. Regional variations developed over time, because apparently even street crepes couldn't resist the Chinese tendency toward culinary innovation. Some areas added different flours to the batter, others experimented with fillings, and a few regions developed their own signature sauce combinations. It was like a breakfast arms race, with each area trying to perfect the ideal handheld morning meal. The best Jianbing vendors developed loyal followings. Regular customers would line up at their favourite stall, knowing exactly how their vendor seasoned the batter, how crispy they made the egg, and which sauce combination worked best. It was fast food, but it was also personal. Your Jianbing vendor knew your preferences, your schedule, and probably your life story if you'd been going there long enough. Did it sometimes drip sauce down your sleeve? Yes. Were the eggs occasionally overcooked? Sure. Did anyone care when they were holding a warm, savoury, perfectly portable breakfast that cost almost nothing, not even slightly? Jianbing was the perfect marriage of convenience and comfort, and it had been feeding people on the go for centuries before anyone thought to call it fast food. Long before anyone invented gummy bears or lollipops, ancient China had candied haws, which were exactly what they sound like. Hawthorn berries preserved in sugar until they reached a state of sweet, chewy perfection. They were nature's candy, assuming nature had access to refined sugar, and a deep fryer, which thankfully it did, at least in Chinese markets. Hawthorn berries were the star of this show, small red fruits that were naturally tart and supposedly good for digestion. The Chinese had been eating them fresh for centuries, but some innovative cook during the Song dynasty looked at these sour little berries and thought, what if we made them candy instead? And thus began one of the most successful fruit preservation methods in history. The process was deceptively simple. Fresh hawthorn berries were cleaned, sometimes pitted if the vendor was feeling generous, and then simmered in sugar syrup until they absorbed enough sweetness to counteract their natural tartness. The result was a chewy, sweet and sour treat that could last for weeks, without refrigeration, and tasted like concentrated happiness. But candied haws weren't just about preservation, they were about transformation. The tough little berries became soft and yielding, while their sharp flavour mellowed into something complex and satisfying. It was like alchemy, if alchemy involved fruit and sugar, instead of lead and disappointment. Street vendors would display candied haws in wooden trays or ceramic bowls, the bright red berries glistening like edible jewels. Children would press their noses against the displays, trying to count how many they could afford with their pocket money, while adults pretended they weren't equally tempted by the glossy little treats. The eating experience was pure nostalgia, even for people experiencing it for the first time. The berries were soft enough to bite through easily, but substantial enough to provide a satisfying chew. The sweetness hit first, followed by the underlying tartness of the fruit, creating a flavour profile that was both familiar and exotic. Candied haws also had the advantage of being considered healthy, at least by ancient standards. Hawthorn berries were believed to aid digestion, strengthen the heart, and boost circulation. Never mind that they were now essentially candy, they were still technically fruit, which meant eating them was practically medicinal. Regional variations developed because apparently even candied fruit couldn't escape Chinese culinary creativity. Some areas candied other fruits alongside the haws, others experimented with different sugar concentrations, and a few regions developed methods for drying the candied berries into chewy, concentrated treats that could travel long distances without spoiling. The seasonality of candied haws added to their appeal. Fresh hawthorn berries were only available in autumn, which meant candied haws had a natural marketing cycle. Vendors would stock up during harvest season, candying massive batches that would last through winter and into spring. By summer, they were rare enough to feel special again, Smart vendors also learned to use candied haws as loss leaders, selling them at minimal profit to attract customers who would then buy other, more expensive snacks. It was ancient retail psychology in action, using the appeal of sweet, affordable treats to build customer loyalty and increase overall sales. Did they sometimes stick to your teeth? Absolutely. Were they occasionally over-sweetened to the point of causing immediate regret? Sure. Did people continue buying them by the handful anyway? Without question, because candied haws hit that perfect sweet spot between healthy and indulgent, affordable and special, familiar and exciting. The vendors who specialised in candied haws were artists in their own right. They understood sugar chemistry, fruit selection and timing. They knew how to balance sweetness with tartness, how to achieve the perfect texture, and how to store their products to maintain quality. It was a craft that required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of what made fruit into candy instead of just sweetened fruit. In the grand tradition of taking simple ingredients and turning them into something unnecessarily complex, ancient Chinese confectioners invented sesame seed candy. This was basically peanut brittle's sophisticated older sibling, if peanut brittle had been raised in a monastery and studied philosophy in its spare time. The concept was elegantly simple: sesame seeds, sugar, and heat. But like most things that seem simple, the execution required skill, timing, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing that rushing the process would result in either burnt sugar or a sticky mess that could glue your jaw shut for the better part of an afternoon. Sesame seeds were toasted first, which was crucial because raw sesame seeds in candy are about as appealing as sand in your lunch. The toasting brought out their nutty flavour and gave them a satisfying crunch that would survive the sugar coating process. This wasn't accidental, it was chemistry, even though the chemists hadn't been invented yet. The sugar was melted carefully, heated to just the right temperature where it would harden into a crisp shell, but not burn into bitter caramel. This required constant attention and a deep understanding of how sugar behaved under heat. Get it wrong, and you'd end up with either chewy candy that stuck to everything or hard candy that could crack teeth. Once the sugar reached the perfect temperature, the toasted sesame seeds were folded in quickly, coated evenly, and then poured onto a flat surface to cool. The mixture had to be worked fast, because sugar waits for no one. Vendors would spread it thin, score it into squares while it was still warm, and then wait for it to cool into crispy, nutty perfection. The result was candy that was simultaneously delicate and substantial. The sesame seeds provided texture and flavour, while the sugar added sweetness and held everything together. It was crunchy without being hard, sweet without being overwhelming, and sophisticated in a way that made you feel slightly cultured while eating what was essentially nuts glued together with candy. Sesame seed candy was also remarkably portable. Unlike sticky candies or crumbly treats, it travelled well and could survive being carried around in pockets or pouches without turning into a disaster. This made it popular with travellers, students, and anyone who needed a snack that wouldn't embarrass them in polite company. The preparation process became a neighbourhood event. The smell of toasting sesame seeds and melting sugar would draw curious onlookers, and children would gather to watch the vendor work. There was something mesmerising about the transformation from simple ingredients to glossy candy, and the aroma alone was enough to create instant customers. Regional variations developed because apparently even sesame seed candy couldn't resist the Chinese impulse toward culinary innovation. Some areas added pine nuts or peanuts to the mix, others experimented with different types of sugar, and a few regions developed methods for creating layered candies with different nuts and seeds. The candy also had supposed health benefits, which made it easier to justify eating. Sesame seeds were believed to strengthen bones, improve circulation, and boost energy. Never mind that they were now held together with enough sugar to power a small village. They were still technically seeds, which meant eating sesame seed candy was practically taking vitamins. Street vendors would break the candy into irregular pieces and sell them by weight, creating a rustic, handmade appearance that suggested quality and attention to detail. The uneven pieces were actually a selling point, proving that each batch was made by hand rather than mass-produced in some distant factory. Did it sometimes get stuck in your teeth? Yes. Did the sugar coating occasionally crack off in inconvenient ways? Absolutely. Did anyone care when they were eating something that tasted like toasted nuts and concentrated sunshine? Not even slightly. Sesame seed candy was proof that sometimes the simplest ideas are the best ones, especially when they involve sugar and enough heat to make everything stick together. In ancient China, if you wanted to turn fruit into candy without adding sugar, you looked to persimmons. These orange orbs of concentrated sweetness were nature's answer to the candy store, assuming nature had a sweet tooth and an understanding of food preservation that bordered on genius. Fresh persimmons were already sweet, but they had a problem. They were only available for a few weeks each autumn, and they didn't travel well. Plus, unripe persimmons had enough tannins to pucker your mouth so severely that speaking became temporarily impossible. Clearly, this was a fruit that needed human intervention. The drying process was part art, part science, and part patience. Ripe persimmons were peeled, leaving the stems attached, and then hung on strings in areas with good air circulation, but no direct sunlight. The goal was to dehydrate them slowly and evenly, concentrating their natural sugars while preventing spoilage or over-drying. Over the course of several weeks, the persimmons would gradually shrink and darken, developing a wrinkled exterior that looked distinctly unappetizing, but concealed concentrated sweetness within. The best dried persimmons were soft and chewy, with a texture somewhere between dates and figs and a flavour that was intensely sweet with hints of honey and brown sugar. The transformation was remarkable. What started as moderately sweet, somewhat astringent fruit became candy-like treats that could last for months without refrigeration. The natural sugars concentrated as the water evaporated, creating treats that were almost too sweet to eat in large quantities, which was probably for the best, given their caloric density. Dried persimmons became status symbols as much as snacks. The process required time, space, and favourable weather conditions, which meant not everyone could make them successfully. Having a good supply of properly dried persimmons was a sign that you had the resources and knowledge to preserve fruit properly, which was no small accomplishment in the ancient world. The eating experience was pure indulgence. Dried persimmons were soft enough to bite through easily, but dense enough to provide a satisfying chew. The sweetness was complex, with layers of flavour that developed as you ate them. They were nature's candy, concentrated into a form that was both portable and luxurious. Street vendors would sell dried persimmons individually or in small packages, often displaying them in attractive arrangements to show off their quality. The best specimens were plump, evenly coloured, and covered with a light dusting of natural fruit sugars that had crystallised on the surface during the drying process. Regional techniques developed for drying persimmons, because apparently even fruit preservation couldn't escape Chinese culinary creativity. Some areas developed methods for creating partially dried persimmons that were still soft and juicy inside. Others perfected techniques for fully dried persimmons that could last for years. And a few regions experimented with smoking or flavouring the persimmons during the drying process. The seasonality of dried persimmons added to their appeal. Fresh persimmons were only available in autumn, but dried persimmons could be enjoyed throughout the year. They became special treats for winter celebrations, spring festivals, and summer snacks when fresh fruit was scarce. Dried persimmons also had supposed medicinal properties which made eating them feel virtuous rather than indulgent. They were believed to soothe coughs, aid digestion, and provide energy. Whether or not this was true, it certainly made it easier to justify eating what was essentially natural candy. Did they sometimes have an odd, slightly leathery texture? Yes. Were they occasionally so sweet that eating more than one at a time became overwhelming? Absolutely. Did people treasure them anyway, as one of nature's most successful attempts at candy making? Without question, dried persimmons proved that sometimes the best snacks are the ones where you let nature do most of the work and just provide the patience and technique to make it happen. Long before anyone invented plastic wrap or aluminum foil, ancient Chinese confectioners were using rice paper to create candies with their own edible packaging. This was innovation disguised as convenience, and it resulted in some of the most elegant sweets in the ancient world. Rice paper wasn't actually made from rice, which was probably the first hint that ancient Chinese naming conventions weren't always literal. Instead, it was made from the pith of the rice paper plant, which was processed into thin translucent sheets that were strong enough to wrap candy but delicate enough to dissolve on your tongue. The candies themselves were usually made from maltose, honey, or concentrated fruit syrups, often flavoured with flowers, herbs, or fruit essences. These sweet mixtures were formed into small shapes and then wrapped in rice paper, while still soft, creating packages that looked like tiny edible presents. The appeal of rice paper wrapped sweets was both practical and aesthetic. The rice paper protected the candy from moisture and contamination, while allowing the colours and shapes to show through. It was packaging that added to the experience rather than detracting from it, because instead of unwrapping your candy, you ate the wrapper along with the contents. The texture combination was part of the appeal. The rice paper was virtually flavourless and dissolved almost immediately on your tongue, leaving behind the concentrated sweetness of the candy within. It was like a magic trick if magic tricks involved edible disappearing acts and sugar-induced happiness. Different regions developed their own styles of rice paper wrapped sweets. Some specialised in flour-flavoured candies wrapped in paper so thin it was almost transparent. Others created larger sweets wrapped in multiple layers of paper for extended dissolving action, and a few areas developed methods for printing designs or patterns on the rice paper itself. The preparation required skill and timing. The candy had to be soft enough to wrap, but firm enough to hold its shape. The rice paper had to be moistened just enough to become pliable without becoming soggy. And the wrapping had to be done quickly, before the candy hardened or the paper dried out. Street vendors would display rice paper wrapped sweets in wooden boxes or glass cases arranged like edible jewellery. The translucent wrappers caught the light, making the candies glow like precious stones. Children would press their faces against the displays, trying to decide which colours and shapes looked most appealing. The sweets were often given as gifts, particularly during festivals or special occasions. The delicate rice paper wrapping made them feel precious and thoughtful, like someone had taken the time to create something beautiful as well as delicious. They were the ancient equivalent of gift-wrapped chocolates, except the wrapping was part of the treat. Rice paper wrapped sweets also had the advantage of being portion controlled. Each candy was individually wrapped, which made it easy to eat just one, or save some for later. This was probably accidental rather than intentional, but it helped prevent the kind of candy-induced stomach aches that came from eating too many sweets at once. The dissolving rice paper created an interesting eating experience. First came the slight resistance of the wrapper, then the immediate dissolution, followed by the burst of concentrated sweetness from the candy within. It was a textural journey that made eating the candy feel like a small celebration. Did the rice paper sometimes stick to your fingers? Yes. Did it occasionally tear during the wrapping process, creating irregularly shaped packages? Absolutely. Did anyone care when they were eating candy that came with its own edible wrapping paper? Not even slightly. Rice paper wrapped sweets were proof that sometimes the best innovations come from solving practical problems in creative ways, especially when the solution involves making something delicious and beautiful at the same time. In the category of snacks that could get you in trouble with authority figures, fermented rice wine balls occupied a special place. These weren't quite candy and weren't quite alcohol, but they were definitely something that made ancient Chinese dessert time significantly more interesting. The concept was deceptively simple. Glutinous rice was fermented with wine yeast until it developed a sweet, slightly alcoholic flavour, then formed into balls and served as a dessert or snack. The result was something that tasted like sweet rice pudding that had been to a party and come back with stories. The fermentation process was part chemistry, part magic, and part luck. Cooked glutinous rice was mixed with wine yeast and left in a warm place for several days until it developed the characteristic sweet-sour flavour and slight alcoholic content. The rice would become soft and slightly liquidy, with a complex flavour that was both familiar and exotic. The alcohol content was low enough that rice wine balls weren't considered alcoholic beverages, but high enough that eating too many could leave you feeling slightly tipsy and wondering why everything seemed more amusing than usual. This made them popular with adults who wanted dessert with a little extra something, and less popular with parents who didn't want their children getting accidentally intoxicated by snack food. The texture was unique, somewhere between pudding and jelly, with individual rice grains that had softened but retained just enough structure to provide textural interest. The flavour was sweet and complex, with the fermentation adding depth and a slight tang that balanced the natural sweetness of the rice. Street vendors would serve rice wine balls in small bowls, often garnished with osmanthus flowers or sweet syrup to enhance their appeal. The presentation was elegant, making them feel like a special treat rather than just fermented grain, which was technically what they were. Regional variations developed because apparently even alcoholic rice balls couldn't resist Chinese culinary diversity. Some areas added fruits or nuts to the fermentation process. Others experimented with different types of rice or fermentation times. And a few regions developed methods for creating firmer or softer textures depending on local preferences. The preparation required careful timing and temperature control. Too warm, and the fermentation would proceed too quickly, creating off flavours or too much alcohol. Too cool, and the fermentation would stall, leaving you with plain rice instead of the complex, sweet-sour treat you were aiming for. Rice wine balls were often served at celebrations and festivals, particularly those that called for special foods or symbolic dishes. The fermentation process was seen as transformative, turning simple rice into something more complex and interesting, which made them appropriate for occasions that marked change or transition. The slight alcoholic content also gave rice wine balls supposed medicinal properties. They were believed to aid digestion, warm the body, and boost circulation. Whether or not this was true, it certainly made eating them feel like taking medicine if medicine was delicious and made you feel slightly more cheerful than usual. Did they sometimes over-ferment, becoming more alcoholic than intended? Yes. Were they occasionally under-fermented, resulting in disappointingly plain rice balls? Absolutely. Did people continue making and eating them anyway? Without question, because rice wine balls hit that perfect sweet spot between dessert and adventure, providing both sugar and a small amount of safe rebellion in a single bowl. The vendors who specialised in rice wine balls were part cook, part chemist, and part entertainer. They understood fermentation, timing, and customer psychology. They knew how to create consistent results from an inherently variable process, and how to present their products in ways that emphasised the exotic nature of fermented desserts without alarming customers, who just wanted something sweet. If there was one thing ancient Chinese confectioners understood, it was that sugar could improve almost anything. Long before molecular gastronomy or fusion cuisine, they were experimenting with sugar coatings on fruits, nuts, seeds, and anything else that would hold still long enough to be dipped in crystallized sweetness. The technique was simple in concept, but required considerable skill in execution. A syrup was made from sugar and water, heated to the exact temperature, where it would harden into a crisp shell when cooled. Items to be coated were dipped quickly in the hot syrup, then removed and allowed to cool until the sugar crystallized into a hard, glossy coating. The temperature control was crucial. Too cool, and the sugar wouldn't coat properly, leaving you with sticky, uneven coverage. Too hot, and the sugar would burn, creating bitter flavors that ruined everything. The best candy makers could judge the temperature by sight, sound, and the way the syrup behaved when stirred. Everything got the sugar treatment. Walnuts, almonds, and pine nuts were transformed into glossy, sweet, and savoury treats. Fresh fruits like grapes and oranges were given crystal coatings that preserved them and added textural interest. Even vegetables like cherry tomatoes weren't safe from the sugar coating trend, creating combinations that were either inspired or deeply confused, depending on your perspective. The process created a satisfying eating experience that was part archaeology, part adventure. First came the crack of breaking through the sugar shell, followed by the burst of whatever was hidden inside. It was like edible surprise packages, except you usually knew what you were getting into based on the shape of the coating. Sugar-coated nuts were particularly popular because they solved multiple problems at once. The coating preserved the nuts, added sweetness to balance any natural bitterness, and created a snack that was both portable and special occasion worthy. They were everyday food dressed up for a party, and they managed to be both practical and indulgent. Street vendors would display their sugar-coated wares in attractive arrangements, the glossy coatings catching light and creating displays that looked like edible jewellery. Children would stand transfixed by the sparkle and shine, while adults pretended they weren't equally mesmerised by the transformation of ordinary food into something that looked almost magical. The seasonality of sugar-coated treats added to their appeal. Different fruits and nuts came into season at different times, which meant the selection was constantly changing. Spring brought sugar-coated fresh fruits, summer offered berries and stone fruits, autumn featured nuts and persimmons, and winter saw creative combinations of preserved and dried items. Regional specialties developed because apparently even sugar coating couldn't escape Chinese culinary innovation. Some areas became known for their sugar-coated pine nuts, others specialised in crystallised fruits, and a few regions developed signature techniques for creating multi-layered coatings or flavoured sugar shells. The social aspect of sugar-coated treats was significant. They were often shared at gatherings, used as gifts, and served at celebrations. The effort required to create them made them feel special, while the universal appeal of sugar made them accessible to people of all ages and backgrounds. Did the coatings sometimes crack off in large pieces, leaving you with plain fruit and a handful of sugar shards? Yes. Were they occasionally so sweet that eating more than one required serious commitment? Absolutely. Did people continue experimenting with sugar coating new and increasingly questionable items? Without hesitation, because the combination of sugar and surprise was apparently irresistible to ancient Chinese confectioners. The vendors who mastered sugar coating were artists in their own right. They understood heat, timing, and chemistry. They knew how to work quickly while the sugar was hot, how to achieve even coatings, and how to store their products to maintain the crisp shell that made the whole concept work. It was a craft that required skill, patience, and a willingness to occasionally burn your fingers in pursuit of perfectly crystallized sweetness. Long before Japanese mochi became internationally famous, ancient China had its own version of chewy, glutinous rice treats that were equally addictive and considerably more diverse in their preparation and flavouring. These weren't quite the same as their Japanese cousins, but they shared the same basic appeal: rice that had been transformed into something completely different through the magic of steaming, pounding, and creative seasoning. The process began with glutinous rice, which despite its name contained no gluten whatsoever. This was ancient Chinese naming at its most confusing, but the rice itself was perfect for creating chewy, sticky textures that regular rice could never achieve. The grains were soaked overnight, then steamed until they became translucent and incredibly sticky. The real work began after steaming. The hot rice was transferred to large mortars and pounded with wooden pestles until it formed a smooth, elastic dough. This wasn't gentle mixing. This was aggressive pounding that required strength, timing, and coordination. Two people would often work together, one holding the mortar steady while the other wielded the pestle with rhythmic precision. The pounding process was crucial because it broke down the individual rice grains and created the characteristic chewy texture that made glutinous rice cakes so distinctive. Underpounded rice would be grainy and unpleasant, while overpounded rice became gummy and difficult to work with. The sweet spot required experience and attention to the changing texture of the rice as it transformed. Once the rice reached the proper consistency, it could be shaped, filled, or flavoured in dozens of different ways. Sweet versions were filled with red bean paste, lotus seed paste, or sweetened nuts. Savoury versions contained seasoned meat, vegetables, or preserved ingredients. Some were left plain and served with dipping sauces or seasonings. The shaping techniques were as varied as the fillings. Some rice cakes were formed into perfect spheres. Others were flattened into discs, and a few were shaped into elaborate decorative forms for special occasions. The sticky nature of the rice made it incredibly malleable, allowing for creative presentations that would have been impossible with regular rice. Street vendors would display their glutinous rice cakes in bamboo steamers, keeping them warm and moist while showing off the variety of shapes, colours, and fillings available. The visual appeal was significant, with different coloured rices creating rainbow effects and creative shaping, making each variety instantly recognisable. The eating experience was unique and somewhat challenging. Glutinous rice cakes were chewy to the point of being almost tough, requiring dedicated chewing and careful attention to avoid biting your own tongue. They were substantial in a way that made them feel more like a meal than a snack, despite often being quite small. Regional variations flourished because apparently even pounded rice couldn't escape Chinese culinary creativity. Northern regions developed heartier, more savoury versions suitable for cold weather. Southern areas created delicate, sweet varieties that showcased local fruits and nuts, and coastal regions experimented with seafood fillings that pushed the boundaries of what rice cakes could contain. The preparation was often a community activity. The pounding process was labour-intensive enough that neighbours would help each other, creating social events around food preparation. Children would watch the rhythmic pounding while adults shared gossip and advice, making glutinous rice cakes as much about community building as snack creation. Seasonal ingredients kept the selection interesting throughout the year. Spring brought fresh bamboo shoots and early vegetables. Summer featured fruits and flowers. Autumn offered nuts and preserved ingredients, and winter saw rich, warming fillings designed to provide comfort during cold months. The texture took some getting used to, especially for people encountering glutinous rice cakes for the first time. They were chewy beyond anything most people had experienced, with a stickiness that could be challenging to navigate. But for those who grew up with them, the texture was part of the appeal, providing a satisfying chewing experience that made eating them feel like a small workout? Did they sometimes stick to your teeth with the tenacity of industrial adhesive? Yes. Were they occasionally so chewy that your jaw got tired before you finished eating them? Absolutely. Did people continue making and eating them anyway, developing dozens of regional variations and preparation methods? Without question, because glutinous rice cakes represented the kind of food alchemy that transformed simple ingredients into something completely different and surprisingly satisfying. Before anyone invented vitamin supplements or fruit snacks, ancient China had preserved fruits, which managed to be both healthy and candy-like, while lasting longer than most political dynasties. These weren't simply dried fruits. They were fruits that had been treated with salt, sugar, spices, and time until they reached a state of concentrated flavour that was both familiar and exotic. The preservation process was part science, part art, and part patience. Fresh fruits were cleaned, sometimes pitted or peeled, and then treated with various combinations of salt, sugar, honey, and spices. The goal was to remove enough moisture to prevent spoilage while concentrating the flavours and adding new taste dimensions through the preservation ingredients. Different fruits required different treatments. Plums were often salted and partially dried, creating sour sweet treats with a chewy texture and complex flavour. Apricots were sweetened and dried until they became candy-like morsels that could satisfy sugar cravings while providing the illusion of healthy eating. Oranges were candied in honey until their peels became translucent and incredibly sweet. The salt-preserved fruits were particularly interesting because they challenged Western assumptions about fruit being sweet. Salted plums, apricots, and even grapes created flavour profiles that were simultaneously sour, salty, and slightly sweet, appealing to palates that appreciated complexity over simple sweetness. The preservation process also concentrated the supposed medicinal properties of the fruits. Preserved plums were believed to aid digestion and settle upset stomachs. Candied orange peel was thought to help with respiratory problems. Dried apricots were considered good for the complexion and overall health. Whether or not these beliefs had any basis in reality, they certainly made eating preserved fruits feel virtuous rather than indulgent. Street vendors would display preserved fruits in attractive jars and containers, the various colours and textures creating appealing visual arrangements. Different preservation methods produced different appearances, from the dark, wrinkled surface of salt-dried plums to the translucent glow of honey-candied fruits. The eating experience varied dramatically depending on the fruit and preservation method. Salt-preserved fruits delivered intense, concentrated flavours that could make your eyes water and your mouth pucker. Sweet preserved fruits provided candy-like satisfaction with the added complexity of real fruit flavours. The textures ranged from chewy to leathery to almost crispy, depending on how much moisture had been removed. Regional specialties developed based on local fruits and traditional preservation methods. Some areas became famous for their preserved lychees, others specialised in candied winter melons, and a few regions developed unique spice blends that created signature flavour profiles for their preserved fruits. The portability of preserved fruits made them popular with travellers, students, and workers who needed snacks that wouldn't spoil during long journeys or hot weather. They were concentrated nutrition in a form that could survive weeks or months, without refrigeration, making them valuable both as food and as trade goods. Seasonal production cycles meant that preserved fruits were often associated with specific times of year. The fruit preserving season was a busy time for vendors and home cooks alike, with everyone working to process the harvest into forms that would last through the winter and into the following year. The social aspects of preserved fruit consumption were significant. They were often shared as gestures of hospitality, given as gifts, and used as special treats during celebrations. The effort required to preserve fruits properly made them feel valuable and thoughtful, while their long shelf life meant they could be saved for appropriate occasions. Did some preservation methods result in fruits that were too salty to enjoy? Yes. Were others so sweet that eating more than a small amount became overwhelming? Absolutely. Did people continue experimenting with preservation techniques, creating new combinations of fruits, seasonings, and methods? Without hesitation, because preserved fruits represented the perfect marriage of practicality and pleasure, nutrition and indulgence. The vendors who specialized in preserved fruits were part chemist, part artist, and part fortune teller. They had to understand the chemistry of preservation, the aesthetics of presentation, and the seasonal rhythms that determined when different fruits would be available and when customers would be most interested in purchasing preserved versions. In the grand tradition of taking simple ingredients and making them unnecessarily complicated, ancient Chinese cooks invented tea eggs, which were exactly what they sound like. Eggs cooked in tea until they absorbed enough flavour and colour to become something completely different from regular boiled eggs. The process was deceptively complex for something that started with just eggs and tea. Hard-boiled eggs were cracked gently all over, creating a network of small fissures in the shell without actually breaking it. Then they were simmered for hours in a mixture of black tea, soy sauce, spices and sometimes sugar, until the liquid penetrated through the cracks and created beautiful marbled patterns throughout the egg white. The visual appeal was significant. When peeled, tea eggs revealed intricate brown patterns that looked like abstract art or ancient calligraphy. No two eggs were exactly alike because the cracking pattern was impossible to control precisely, which meant each egg was a small surprise wrapped in an edible package. The flavour was complex and subtle, with the tea providing tannins that gave the eggs a slightly astringent quality, while the soy sauce added umami depth and the spices contributed warmth and complexity. The egg yolk remained relatively unchanged, providing a familiar creamy centre surrounded by the transformed white. Tea eggs were the perfect portable protein for a society that was constantly on the move. They could be prepared in advance, travelled well, and provided substantial nutrition in a convenient, self-contained package. They were the ancient equivalent of protein bars, except they actually tasted good and didn't require industrial processing. Street vendors would keep tea eggs warm in the cooking liquid, ladling them out for customers who wanted a quick, satisfying snack. The eggs would be peeled fresh, revealing their marbled patterns and releasing the aromatic blend of tea and spices that had infused them during the long cooking process. Regional variations developed because apparently even tea-soaked eggs couldn't escape Chinese culinary creativity. Some areas used different types of tea, others experimented with spice blends, and a few regions developed techniques for creating more dramatic colour patterns or stronger flavours. The preparation was often done in large batches, with vendors cooking dozens of eggs at once in enormous pots that filled their stalls with aromatic steam. The long cooking process meant that tea eggs had to be planned in advance, but the results were worth the time investment. The social aspects of tea egg consumption were interesting. They were substantial enough to serve as light meals, portable enough to eat while walking, and affordable enough for most people to buy regularly. They occupied a unique niche between street snack and proper food, satisfying hunger without requiring utensils or elaborate preparation. The cooking liquid was often reused multiple times, with vendors adding more tea, spices, and seasonings to maintain the flavour profile while developing deeper, more complex tastes over time. Some vendors claimed that their cooking liquid had been continuously maintained for years, creating legendary flavour depth that attracted customers from across the city. Tea eggs also had supposed health benefits, which made eating them feel responsible rather than indulgent. The tea was believed to provide antioxidants The long cooking process was thought to make the proteins more digestible, and the spices were credited with various medicinal properties. Whether or not any of this was true, it certainly made tea eggs feel like a virtuous choice. Did the long cooking process sometimes result in eggs that were overcooked and rubbery? Yes. Were the flavours occasionally too strong, overwhelming the natural taste of the eggs? Absolutely. Did people continue making and eating them anyway, developing dozens of regional variations and preparation methods? Without question, because tea eggs represented the kind of culinary innovation that took something ordinary and transformed it into something special through patience, skill, and creative seasoning. In perhaps the most ambitious example of ancient Chinese food transformation, someone looked at lotus root, a starchy, somewhat bland vegetable that grew in muddy water, and decided it needed to become candy. The result was candied lotus root, which managed to be both recognizable as a vegetable and completely transformed into something that belonged in the dessert category. Lotus root was an interesting choice for candying because of its unique appearance. When sliced, it revealed a pattern of holes that looked like lace or decorative screens, creating beautiful geometric designs that were naturally ornamental. This meant that candied lotus root wasn't just sweet, it was also visually striking in a way that made it appropriate for special occasions and gifts. The candying process was elaborate and time-consuming. Fresh lotus root was cleaned, peeled, and sliced into thick rounds, revealing the characteristic hole pattern. The slices were then simmered in sugar syrup for hours, sometimes days, until they absorbed enough sweetness to be transformed from vegetable to candy while retaining their structural integrity and decorative appearance. The challenge was achieving the right balance between sweetness and texture. Too little cooking, and the lotus root remained vegetable-like and unappetizing. Too much cooking, and it became mushy, and lost the structural integrity that made it visually appealing. The sweet spot required experience, patience, and careful attention to how the root was responding to the candying process. The result was something that looks like decorative candy, but tasted like concentrated sweetness with subtle vegetable undertones. The texture was unique, somewhere between candy and preserved fruit, with enough substance to feel satisfying, but enough sweetness to qualify as dessert. Candied lotus root was often served at banquets and special occasions, both because of its visual appeal and because of the effort required to prepare it properly. The beautiful hole patterns made each slice look like edible art, while the labour-intensive preparation made it feel appropriately special for important events. The preparation required skill and timing that not everyone possessed. The lotus root had to be fresh and properly cleaned. The sugar syrup had to be the right concentration, and the cooking process had to be monitored carefully to achieve the desired texture and sweetness level. It was a specialised skill that separated amateur cooks from serious confectioners. Street vendors occasionally offered candied lotus root, but it was more commonly found in specialty shops or prepared at home for special occasions. The time and effort required made it impractical for everyday street food, but the results were impressive enough to justify the investment for celebrations and gifts. Regional variations developed in both preparation methods and presentation styles. Some areas preferred thicker slices that showcased the hole patterns more dramatically. Others developed techniques for creating different levels of sweetness or texture, and a few regions experimented with adding spices or flavourings to the candying syrup. The eating experience was unlike anything else in the ancient Chinese snack repertoire. The visual appeal created anticipation, the texture provided substance and satisfaction, and the sweetness delivered on the promise of candy while retaining enough vegetable character to feel somehow healthy. Candied lotus root also had symbolic significance in Chinese culture. The lotus was associated with purity and enlightenment, which made candied lotus root feel spiritually appropriate as well as delicious. It was food that looked beautiful, tasted sweet, and carried positive cultural associations, which was probably as close to perfect snack food as ancient China was going to get. Did the candying process sometimes fail, resulting in lotus root that was either too tough or too mushy? Yes. Was it occasionally so sweet that eating more than a small amount became overwhelming? Absolutely. Did people continue making it anyway, perfecting techniques and creating regional variations? Without question, because candied lotus root represented the kind of culinary ambition that transformed humble vegetables into something extraordinary through skill, patience, and enough sugar to make anything taste good. The world of ancient Chinese junk food wasn't just about taste and convenience. It was also a complex social and economic system that reflected class structures, regional differences, and cultural values. Street food vendors weren't just feeding people. They were participating in an elaborate dance of supply and demand that had been perfecting itself for centuries. At the bottom of the economic ladder were the vendors who specialized in the cheapest, most filling snacks. These were the Yo Tiao sellers, who set up before dawn with their vats of recycled oil. The jianbing makers, who could turn a few simple ingredients into a complete meal. And the tea egg vendors, who provided protein at prices that day labourers could afford. These vendors operated on razor-thin margins, making their profit through volume and consistency. They knew their customers personally, understood their schedules and preferences, and built their businesses on reliability rather than innovation. A youtiao vendor who showed up every morning at the same corner with consistently good products could build a following that lasted for decades. The middle tier consisted of vendors who offered more specialized or labor-intensive products. Tang hulu makers, stinky tofu specialists, and candied fruit vendors required more skill, better ingredients, and often more initial investment in equipment and supplies. Their profit margins were higher, but their customer base was smaller and more discriminating. These vendors had to balance quality with affordability, creating products that felt special enough to justify higher prices while remaining accessible to middle-class customers. They were the ancient equivalent of fast casual dining, offering better ingredients and more complex preparation than street vendors while maintaining the convenience and informality that made street food appealing. At the top of the street food hierarchy were the vendors who created luxury snacks for wealthy customers, candied lotus root makers, rice paper wrapped sweet specialists, and vendors who offered exotic or highly seasonal items catered to customers who valued rarity, presentation, and sophisticated flavors over simple sustenance. These vendors operated more like small businesses than street stalls, often working from established shops rather than mobile carts. They invested in premium ingredients, elaborate preparation methods, and attractive presentation, creating products that were as much about status and enjoyment as about hunger satisfaction. The seasonal nature of many ancient Chinese snacks created interesting economic dynamics. Vendors had to plan months in advance, processing fruits and vegetables during harvest season to create preserved products that would last through the winter. This required capital investment, storage space, and the ability to predict demand for products that wouldn't be sold for months. The geographic distribution of snack vendors reflected both practical considerations and cultural preferences. Areas near markets and transportation hubs attracted vendors selling quick, portable foods to travellers and traders. Residential neighbourhoods favoured vendors offering comfort foods and familiar favourites. Entertainment districts drew vendors specialising in novel or exotic items that appealed to people looking for new experiences. The social aspects of street food consumption were significant. Sharing snacks was a common gesture of friendship and hospitality. Business deals were often concluded over shared plates of dumplings or candied fruits. Children learned social skills by interacting with vendors and making small purchases with pocket money. The relationship between vendors and customers was often personal and long-term. Regular customers developed preferences for specific vendors who would remember their favourite items, spice levels, and preparation methods. This created loyalty that went beyond simple convenience, building communities around food that lasted for generations. The regulation of street food was minimal by modern standards, but social pressure and reputation were powerful forces that kept most vendors honest. A vendor who served bad food or cheated customers would quickly lose business as word spread through the community. The investment required to establish a successful street food business was too significant to risk destroying through dishonest practices. Innovation in street food was driven by competition and customer demand rather than formal research and development. Vendors who created new products or improved existing ones could build competitive advantages, while those who failed to adapt to changing tastes or seasonal availability would gradually lose customers to more creative competitors. The training of street food vendors was typically informal, passed down through families, or learned through apprenticeships with established vendors. The skills required weren't just culinary. They included understanding customer psychology, managing money, predicting weather and seasonal changes, and building the kind of personal relationships that kept customers coming back. Did the system sometimes result in vendors selling questionable food to unsuspecting customers? Yes. Were there occasional price wars that drove smaller vendors out of business? Absolutely. Did the overall system create a diverse, affordable, and culturally rich food landscape that fed people at every economic level? Without question, because ancient Chinese street food represented the kind of grassroots capitalism that emerged when people needed to eat and other people figured out how to feed them at a profit. Behind every crispy youtiao and perfectly candied fruit was a sophisticated understanding of food science that ancient Chinese cooks had developed through centuries of experimentation, observation, and careful attention to the relationship between ingredients, time, temperature, and technique. The oil management for deep-fried foods like youtiao was particularly impressive. Street vendors developed methods for maintaining oil at consistent temperatures without thermometers, judging heat by the behavior of the oil when small pieces of dough were dropped in. They understood how to extend oil life through careful filtering and temperature control, and they knew which foods could share oil without contaminating flavors. The oil itself was often a complex blend of different fats, chosen for their smoking points, flavors, and availability. Lard provided richness and high heat tolerance, vegetable oils added lighter flavors, and sometimes nut oils were included for their distinctive tastes. The best vendors developed signature oil blends that contributed to the unique flavor profiles of their products. Sugar work required an even more sophisticated understanding of chemistry, though ancient Chinese confectioners thought of it in terms of observation and experience rather than molecular science. They understood the different stages of sugar heating, from simple syrup through soft ball, hard ball, and finally to the crack stage that was perfect for coating fruits and nuts. The timing of sugar work was crucial and unforgiving. Ancient confectioners developed various tests for determining when sugar had reached the proper temperature, from observing the colour and behaviour of boiling syrup to dropping small amounts in cold water and testing the texture of the cooled sugar. Fermentation was perhaps the most complex technology employed by ancient Chinese snack makers. The creation of stinky tofu required understanding bacterial cultures, pH levels, and environmental conditions, even though the vocabulary for describing these concepts didn't exist yet. Successful fermentation was achieved through careful control of temperature, humidity, and time. The rice wine ball makers had to understand yeast biology, sugar chemistry, and alcohol production, managing fermentation to achieve the right balance of sweetness, alcohol content, and texture. This required monitoring fermentation progress, adjusting conditions as needed, and timing the process to produce consistent results. Preservation techniques represented another area of sophisticated food technology. The creation of preserved fruits required understanding moisture content, salt chemistry, and the relationship between pH and bacterial growth. Ancient Chinese food preservers developed methods for creating products that were both safe and delicious, often lasting for months without refrigeration. The equipment used by ancient Chinese snack makers was simple but precisely designed for specific tasks. Deep frying vessels were shaped to promote even oil circulation and easy temperature maintenance. Sugar working pots were designed to heat evenly and pour cleanly. Grinding and pounding tools were crafted to achieve specific textures and consistencies. The development of rice paper for wrapping sweets required understanding plant chemistry, processing techniques, and the physical properties of different materials. Creating paper that was strong enough to wrap candy but delicate enough to dissolve on the tongue required precise control of processing methods and careful selection of raw materials. Steaming technology for items like glutinous rice cakes required understanding heat transfer, moisture management, and timing. The bamboo steamers used by ancient Chinese cooks were engineered to provide even heat distribution, proper moisture retention, and easy access for checking doneness. The seasonal timing of snack production required sophisticated understanding of agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and food storage. Vendors had to plan months in advance, processing ingredients when they were at peak quality and abundance, then storing products to maintain quality until they could be sold. Quality control was achieved through sensory evaluation and experience rather than chemical testing. Successful vendors developed the ability to judge doneness, quality, and safety through sight, smell, taste, and touch. They understood how products should look, feel, and behave at different stages of preparation. The scaling of production from individual portions to large batches required understanding how recipes and techniques changed with quantity. What worked for making a few pieces of candy might fail completely when attempted with larger volumes, requiring adjustments to timing, temperature, and technique. Innovation in ancient Chinese snack technology was driven by practical problems: how to make oil last longer, how to achieve more consistent results, how to create products that would travel well or last through different seasons. Solutions were developed through trial and error, shared through communities of practice, and refined over generations. Did this sophisticated understanding sometimes fail, resulting in batches of ruined food and lost investment? Yes. Were there occasional innovations that seemed promising but proved impractical or dangerous? Absolutely. Did the overall system create a technology base that supported a diverse, reliable, and culturally rich snack food industry? Without question, because ancient Chinese food technology represented the kind of practical knowledge that emerges when people have strong incentives to solve problems and enough time to perfect their solutions. As we've wandered through this landscape of ancient Chinese snacks, from the politically motivated youtiao to the chemically complex stinky tofu, it becomes clear that these weren't just foods, they were cultural expressions that reflected values, relationships, and ways of understanding the world that had been developing for thousands of years. The emphasis on transformation was central to ancient Chinese snack culture. Simple ingredients like rice, fruit, and vegetables were routinely transformed into something completely different through the application of heat, time, fermentation, or preservation techniques. This reflected a cultural belief that improvement was possible through skill, patience, and understanding of natural processes. The social aspects of snack consumption were equally important. These weren't foods that were eaten in isolation. They were shared, discussed, and used to build relationships. The vendor-customer interactions, the family traditions around seasonal snack preparation, and the role of special foods in celebrations all contributed to a food culture that was fundamentally communal. The regional diversity of ancient Chinese snacks reflected a culture that valued local adaptation and innovation within broader traditions. Each area developed its own specialties based on available ingredients, local preferences, and historical circumstances, creating a patchwork of culinary traditions that was unified by common techniques and values. The economic accessibility of most ancient Chinese snacks was significant. These weren't luxury foods available only to the wealthy. They were everyday treats that provided pleasure, nutrition, and social connection to people at every economic level. This democratic approach to food pleasure was an important cultural value that influenced how Chinese society thought about fairness and quality of life. The seasonal rhythms of snack production and consumption connected people to natural cycles and agricultural realities in ways that modern processed food has largely eliminated. The anticipation of seasonal specialties, the community effort required for preservation and preparation, and the acceptance that some foods were only available at certain times created a relationship with food that was both practical and romantic. The medicinal aspects of many ancient Chinese snacks reflected a culture that didn't sharply separate food from medicine, pleasure from health, or eating from healing. This holistic approach to nutrition influenced not just what people ate, but how they thought about the relationship between diet and well-being. The technical sophistication required to create many ancient Chinese snacks represented a culture that valued craftsmanship, skill development, and the patient accumulation of knowledge over time. The vendors and home cooks who mastered complex fermentation, preservation, and cooking techniques were practicing a kind of applied science that was both practical and artistic. The aesthetic attention paid to the presentation and appearance of ancient Chinese snacks reflected cultural values that emphasized beauty, harmony, and the importance of visual appeal in creating satisfying experiences. Food wasn't just fuel, it was a form of artistic expression that brought beauty into everyday life. The innovation and experimentation evident in ancient Chinese snack culture showed a society that was curious, creative, and willing to take risks in pursuit of better flavors, textures, and experiences. The constant development of new products, techniques, and variations demonstrated a culture that valued progress and improvement. The preservation of traditional methods alongside innovation reflected a cultural balance between respecting the past and embracing change. Ancient Chinese snack makers maintained proven techniques while continuing to experiment and adapt, creating a food culture that was both stable and dynamic. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine the sounds and smells of an ancient Chinese street market. The sizzle of youtiao in hot oil, the crack of tangulu being bitten for the first time, the patient grinding of sesame seeds into candy, and the gentle fermentation of rice wine balls slowly developing their complex flavours. These foods were more than just snacks. They were expressions of human creativity, community, and the endless quest to transform simple ingredients into something delicious, beautiful, and memorable. They represent a food culture that understood that eating should be pleasurable, social, and connected to the rhythms of the natural world. In a time when food was less certain, less abundant, and less convenient than it is today, ancient Chinese cooks created a snack food culture that was remarkably diverse, sophisticated, and satisfying. They proved that limitations often inspire creativity, that community can be built around shared food experiences, and that the best innovations often come from paying careful attention to simple, fundamental processes. The legacy of ancient Chinese junk food lives on in modern Chinese cuisine, in the street food cultures of cities around the world, and in the basic human understanding that food should be more than just nutrition. It should be pleasure, community, art and science all rolled into one perfectly portable, affordably priced, seasonally appropriate package. Sleep well and dream of sugar-coated everything, fermented rice balls, and the kind of food innovation that emerges when people have simple ingredients, sophisticated techniques, and an unlimited appetite for making ordinary things extraordinary through patience, skill, and just the right amount of hot oil. Good night.